The night was thick with silence, a kind that felt alive in the chilled autumn air. As I stepped into the forest, the world outside seemed to vanish, swallowed by the darkness looming among the trees. Tall pines and twisted oaks rose like solemn sentinels, their branches intertwined to form a canopy that blocked out the starlight, creating a darkness so deep it felt as though it could seep into the bones. The ground was blanketed in leaves, their crisp crunch underfoot the only sound as I walked further into the heart of the woods. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in, a strange heaviness that clung to every step. Occasionally, a breeze would filter through the trees, carrying with it a musty, earthy scent that hinted at things unseen, ancient and hidden, just beyond my line of sight. In this forest, even the smallest noises seemed amplified, the snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves. My heart pounded, quickening with each sound, each shadow cast by the wind's faint breath. There was an unnatural stillness, as if the trees themselves were holding a secret, unwilling to reveal what lay concealed within their depths. It was the kind of silence that makes you wonder if you're really alone, or if something else is out there, watching, waiting, just beyond the veil of darkness. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see what exactly? I didn't know. But an instinct, a primal feeling I couldn't shake, made me feel that I was no longer just a visitor in this forest. I was intruding. There was a hum of anticipation in the air, an invisible pulse that seemed to radiate from the very ground I walked on, as though the forest itself was alive with some hidden awareness. And so I continued forward, deeper and deeper, feeling my heartbeat align with the steady rhythm of my footsteps. With each step, the grip of dread tightened, whispering that this place was not meant for those who wandered unknowingly into its depths. There's a certain weight to a dark forest, a presence that grows the further you venture from the world you know. As I moved deeper into the trees, that feeling thickened, settling on my shoulders, seeping into the air like the fog that pooled between the trunks. It was strange how the forest could be so silent and yet so full, as if an unseen orchestra played a low, ominous hum just beyond the range of my hearing. The shadows grew darker here, shifting with my every step. In the periphery, I could have sworn something moved, a brief flicker of motion that vanished the instant I turned my head to see. Nothing was there. Only trees, stark and unmoving, looming like watchful giants. Yet, as I walked, I began to notice a subtle change in the ground beneath my feet. The dirt, once soft and blanketed in leaves, gave way to patches of damp earth and fallen needles, their scent sharp and biting, mingling with something else, a faint, pungent odor that clung to the air. It was an earthy smell, one I couldn't quite place, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was almost as if something had been through here recently, leaving behind traces of itself, marking the place as its own. I pressed on, my senses sharpening with each step, attuned to every murmur of the wind, every rustle that broke the stillness. It was hard to tell if I was growing closer to whatever had left its scent behind, or if something was drawing me forward, as if beckoning from deep within the forest. A low branch snagged my coat, and I froze, heart pounding at the unexpected touch. In the quiet, even the smallest sound seemed like a gunshot, echoing in the thickened air. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, brushing away the stray twigs and pine needles clinging to my clothes. But as I pulled the branch free, I noticed something odd. A fresh scratch, torn into the bark just above where my hand rested. The mark was jagged, irregular, as though made by something with claws, not teeth. Long, deep gouges scored the wood, angled in a way that suggested whatever had left them was both powerful and deliberate. I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling the rough edges under my skin. The cuts were fresh, and something in the back of my mind whispered that I should turn around, head back before the sun slipped any lower. But curiosity outweighed caution. Or maybe it was something else, a kind of pull, urging me forward. I straightened, casting a wary glance around me. The forest had grown impossibly still, as if every creature, every leaf held its breath. The quiet was thick, unnatural, a hollow silence that pressed in from every side. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, yet I forced myself to take another step, then another, deeper into the woods. The path grew narrower, and as I moved forward, the trees seemed to close in, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching out like skeletal fingers. The scent grew stronger now, more potent, a mixture of wet earth and something sour, almost metallic. I thought of old stories, tales I'd heard about creatures lurking in places just like this, hidden within the dense heart of the forest. Stories that felt as ancient as the trees around me, echoing back to a time when people knew better than to stray too far from the fire. Something crunched behind me. The sound was faint, but it pierced the silence like a blade. I froze, every nerve alert, my breath caught in my throat. The crunch came again, closer this time like a footstep carefully placed, too calculated to belong to an animal. Slowly I turned, scanning the dimness, the shadows that seemed to shift and settle around me. For a moment there was nothing, only trees, only darkness. And then, in the distance, a shape. It was barely visible, a shadow among shadows, but it was there, standing still, watching. I couldn't make out its features, only the sense of something tall, something strong silhouetted against the night. I felt my breath catch, heart hammering against my chest as I squinted into the shadows, trying to discern what was standing there. The shape was elusive, blending almost seamlessly with the dense blackness of the trees. I blinked, half wondering if it was a trick of my mind, an illusion crafted by the swaying branches or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew this was no trick. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, a silent witness, exuding a presence so heavy that the air seemed to thicken with it. I wanted to back away, to turn and leave, but my feet remained rooted to the ground as though some invisible force held them in place. I kept my eyes trained on the figure, trying to make out any details, anything that might tell me what or who it was. But it was too far, too shrouded in the shadows. A shiver traced up my spine as I realized it was watching me. There was an intensity in that stillness, a predatory patience that felt almost unnatural, as though it was gauging me, assessing my every move. The minutes stretched, an uncomfortable standoff between us, neither daring to break the silence. Then, slowly, the figure shifted. It was slight, just a subtle movement, but enough to send a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my veins. It didn't step forward, nor did it retreat. Instead, it seemed to sway, shifting its weight from side to side, as though contemplating its next move. My heart thundered in my chest, a frantic rhythm against the oppressive quiet. I couldn't tell if it was fear or curiosity, but something made me take a cautious step backward, my foot landing lightly on the damp ground. The figure mirrored my movement, taking a step to match my own, and I stopped, breath held. For the first time, I became acutely aware of how far I had wandered from the trail. The path, so clear before, now felt hidden beneath a carpet of leaves and shadows, as though the forest had swallowed it up, leaving me stranded. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my gaze steady. I could feel the weight of those unseen eyes bearing down on me, as if they were studying not just my body, but my thoughts, my intentions. The figure remained still again, locked in its quiet observation, and I felt an irrational urge to speak, to break the silence, as if a simple word could dispel the oppressive atmosphere. But my voice failed me, caught in my throat, stifled by a primal fear I hadn't felt since childhood. As I stood frozen, trying to collect myself, I became aware of a new sound, one so subtle it almost blended with the heartbeat pounding in my ears. A slow, deliberate inhale, followed by an exhale, deep and low, as though something just beyond my vision was drawing in my scent, tasting the air that hung between us. The realization hit me with a cold shock. This thing wasn't just watching me, it was smelling me, familiarizing itself, like a predator sizing up its prey. The thought sent a chill straight to my bones. It was a reminder that I was no longer in control here. This wasn't my territory. I was a trespasser, and the rules had changed. I considered turning to run, but something held me back. The forest around me felt different now, as though it had transformed into a labyrinth, each tree a silent guardian blocking my way out. And there, in the dimness, I could feel the figure's presence stretching toward me, filling the space between us, palpable and relentless. A strange, almost resigned calm settled over me. If I was to escape, I had to move carefully, deliberately, without provoking it. I took a shallow breath, preparing to take a step back, but before I could move, I heard a sound I'll never forget, a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to resonate from the earth itself, vibrating through the roots and soil beneath me. It was a sound filled with warning, a sound that told me I'd come too close. For a moment, I felt a surge of irrational curiosity, a desperate need to glimpse what lay hidden in that darkness. But my instincts were stronger, screaming at me to leave before it was too late. My pulse quickened, and I steeled myself, taking one cautious step backward, then another, keeping my eyes locked on the shape as I moved. The growl faded, but the oppressive silence returned, heavier than before, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if I'd truly leave. With every step I took, the figure remained, an unmoving shadow among the trees, watching me as I retreated. It didn't follow, didn't move, but the weight of its presence lingered, haunting me as I finally turned and slipped back into the depths of the forest, the path to safety as elusive as the creature that had been watching me. I moved through the forest with steps as light as I could manage, weaving between trees, my pulse quickened by the primal warning still humming in my mind. The shape remained a haunting impression in my memory, and each time a shadow fell across my path, my breath caught, half expecting it to reappear, looming close enough to touch. The darkness seemed to grow deeper the further I walked, as if the forest was shifting around me, pulling me back into its depths. I felt the weight of the silence once more, heavier now, thick with a quiet dread. My skin prickled with awareness, each snap of a twig beneath my foot amplifying the feeling that something was nearby, just out of sight. In my mind, I tried to replay my steps, to retrace the path I'd taken, but the memory was hazy, each tree and shadow blurring together in a way that made every direction look the same. As I continued, a sudden noise broke the silence, low and rustling, a sound that felt alive, alert. I stopped, my heart lodged in my throat, every instinct in me screaming to run. I scanned the trees around me, searching for any hint of movement, any glint of eyes watching me. The noise grew louder, almost rhythmic, like something heavy moving through the underbrush, pacing back and forth with a predatory patience. I crouched down, hoping the shadows would obscure me, and strained to listen. It was there, just beyond the trees, a slow, deliberate sound that contrasted with the occasional snapping of branches. Whatever it was large, its weight causing leaves to compress and twigs to snap in a way that felt intentional, like a stalking predator in no rush to close the distance. I held my breath, steadying myself, willing the beating of my heart to quiet. The creature moved closer, and I caught a glimpse of something, a flash of fur, dark and dense, blending into the shadows with uncanny ease. It was just a fragment of an image, but it was enough to send my mind racing, connecting dots, remembering stories of things best left unspoken. I pressed back against the rough bark of a tree, feeling its steady strength, hoping it would shield me from view. The creature paused, and in that agonizing stretch of silence, I could feel it watching me, even though I couldn't see it. Its presence pressed against the air, thick and tangible, a reminder that I was no longer hidden. Slowly, I began to edge away, each movement careful, calculated, testing the forest floor beneath me to avoid making a sound. But fate can be cruel. My foot found a brittle branch, snapping it beneath me, and the sound shot through the quiet like a gunshot. The creature reacted instantly, a low, rumbling growl cutting through the darkness, sharp and guttural, a sound that carried both warning and hunger. I felt my breath hitch, the urge to flee surging through me. But I knew running could trigger a chase, and in the depths of this forest I had no chance of outrunning whatever lurked here. I forced myself to stay still, to slow my breathing, my eyes scanning the undergrowth, hoping to catch another glimpse, to know what was watching me. And then there it was. A faint glint, the briefest flash of light reflecting off a set of eyes. They were dark, intense, peering from beneath a canopy of dense foliage, barely visible yet unmistakably focused on me. It blinked slowly, as if weighing the moment, deciding what to do with me. I fought the rising panic, holding its gaze, knowing that looking away might provoke it, might somehow signal weakness. My fingers pressed into the tree bark, gripping it as though it could anchor me, keep me steady as those eyes continued to assess, cold and calculating. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the glint of eyes vanished, swallowed by the shadows once more. I waited, every muscle tense, expecting it to reappear, to hear that low rumbling growl return. But there was only silence, a stillness so profound that it felt unnatural, as if the forest itself had been commanded to hold its breath. Carefully I rose, my body stiff from crouching in fear. I didn't dare move too quickly, still haunted by the memory of those eyes watching me from the darkness. Each step I took felt like a gamble, a roll of the dice as I wove through the trees, hoping they would grant me safe passage this time. But the forest remained quiet, empty, save for the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. Yet, despite the silence, the feeling lingered. That heavy, foreboding presence followed me, unseen but undeniable, as though something had marked me, chosen to let me go, for now. As I pressed on, I couldn't shake the sense that those eyes were still watching, hidden among the shadows, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to reappear. I could still feel it, the weight of those unseen eyes lingering in the back of my mind as I moved. Every step I took felt like it carried an echo, a reminder of something trailing close behind. The forest seemed denser now, as though each tree had shifted, thickened its trunk, closed its branches around me like a narrowing tunnel. The path was gone, or maybe it had never been there, and I was left to rely on instinct alone, on some primal sense guiding me through the dark. But the quiet was unnatural, almost suffocating, amplifying every small sound, every crack of a twig beneath my feet. I listened carefully, hoping for a hint of the way out, a sound that might promise safety. Yet there was nothing but my own careful breathing, the shallow gasps that filled the air around me. Even the wind had stilled, as though the forest itself held its breath, waiting, observing my every move. Then, just ahead, a faint shape came into view, a low shadow that seemed out of place against the forest floor. I hesitated, heart thumping, but curiosity pulled me closer. Crouching, I reached out, fingers grazing the earth. It was soft, freshly disturbed soil, and there in the middle of it, pressed deep into the dirt, was a footprint. Not human, but something large, with toes spread wide and distinct claw marks etched in the earth. I studied the print, every ridge and line clear, hinting at both strength and stealth. It was as if it had been left there deliberately, a sign, a warning I couldn't ignore. My mind raced, trying to match it to something I knew. Bear, maybe, but the spread of the toes and the length of the claws were wrong. And the size? It dwarfed anything I'd seen before, too big to belong to any animal I could rationalize. I straightened slowly, casting a wary glance around, half expecting to see something watching me from the shadows. But there was only stillness, a quiet that seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't meant to be here, that these woods were home to something far older, something that didn't belong to the world I knew. I took a careful step back, leaving the footprint behind, as though by moving away, I could erase its memory. But the image stayed with me, haunting, vivid, imprinted in my mind as though it had been stamped there as deeply as it was in the soil. I moved forward cautiously, each step laden with the feeling that I was being watched, even if I couldn't see by whom or what. As I ventured further, I noticed more signs. Trees with bark peeled away, claw marks gouged deep into the trunks as if whatever had passed through here had left pieces of itself behind, reminders of its presence. Each mark was a testament to power, to dominance over this place, and the realization sent a shiver through me. It was claiming the forest, declaring its territory. And yet, it let me continue. Each time I considered turning back, a strange pull urged me forward, some unexplainable force whispering that I wasn't finished here, that there was more I needed to see to understand. My pace slowed as I moved, senses on high alert, aware of each tiny shift in the atmosphere, each faint rustle in the undergrowth. Then, as if summoned by my thoughts, a distant sound reached me. A low, rumbling growl carried through the trees, faint but unmistakable. It echoed, rolling through the woods, and I froze, every muscle tensing. This wasn't the same guttural growl I'd heard before. It was different, layered with something that felt like anger, a warning that reached me on a level deeper than words. I knew I'd strayed too close to something primal, something that didn't belong to the daylight world. For a long moment, I stayed rooted, barely daring to breathe, listening as the growl faded, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the forest itself had vanished, leaving me in a void. My mind raced, weighing the urge to turn and flee against the strange compulsion to press on, to discover what lay deeper in the shadows. My decision was made for me when a branch snapped somewhere to my left, closer than the growl had been. My head whipped around, but I saw nothing, only shadows shifting in the faint light. My heartbeat quickened, and I took a slow, deliberate step backward, unable to shake the feeling that whatever lurked here had been watching me all along, waiting for me to reach this exact spot. It was then that I realized it was testing me, drawing me closer with every step, every mark, every echo in the silence. And with that thought, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Fear, yes, but mixed with a deep, unsettling curiosity. Part of me wanted to know what could leave footprints so large, marks so fierce, sounds so ancient that they seemed to reverberate from the roots of the earth itself. I took one last glance around, bracing myself. Whatever waited for me in these woods had already seen me, studied me, and somehow I knew it was only a matter of time before we came face to face. My pulse was a steady drumbeat in the quiet, the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness as I took one careful step after another. There was no going back now. I could feel it as surely as the chill that prickled my skin. Whatever lay ahead had been calling me, drawing me in, and the strange, unsettling curiosity that kept pulling me forward overpowered the instinct to flee. The forest around me seemed to shift, the trees clustering together, forming shapes in the shadows that played tricks on my mind. Their gnarled branches stretched above like skeletal hands reaching for one another, knitting a canopy that blocked what little light was left. I was alone in a darkness so complete, so visceral, that it felt like stepping into another world, a world where logic held no power and primal fears took over. Then, in the distance, I caught sight of something faint, glimmering softly through the trees. I narrowed my eyes, focusing on the dim glow, and realized it was a clearing, just ahead, bathed in a strange, silvery light. The pull grew stronger, urging me toward it, a silent invitation from something beyond my understanding. I moved toward the glow, each step a test of nerve, as I forced myself to keep breathing, to ignore the feeling that I was walking into a trap. The air grew colder as I neared the clearing, sharp and biting against my skin. The strange light seemed to emanate from nowhere, casting the clearing in an unnatural glow, like moonlight trapped within the trees. My gaze swept over the space, taking in the twisted roots and the patchwork of shadows that lay across the ground. At the center of the clearing was an enormous tree, its trunk thick and ancient, its bark twisted with deep, spiraling grooves that looked almost like scars. And then I saw it. There, just at the base of the tree, was a scattering of objects, arranged in a rough circle. I stepped closer, cautiously, drawn by a mixture of fascination and dread. Bones, small ones, larger ones, all bleached and broken, some shattered as if by great force. Mixed in with the bones were other things, bits of fur, scraps of cloth, pieces of what looked like charred wood. The arrangement was deliberate, precise, as though something had carefully placed each item to form a message or a warning. My heart sank as I realized these weren't random artifacts. They were remnants, trophies collected over time, reminders of lives that had crossed paths with something ancient and relentless. A chill ran through me, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see those dark eyes watching from the shadows, waiting for my reaction. But the forest was silent, holding its breath. I was alone, left to piece together the meaning of what lay before me. As I stared at the makeshift shrine, the hairs on the back of my neck rose, prickling with a sense of something just beyond my comprehension. This wasn't just a display, it was a marker, a boundary that had been set. I had wandered into a territory claimed by something with a fierce and unforgiving presence, something that did not tolerate intruders. My eyes drifted back to the tree, its bark scarred and twisted. I reached out, fingers grazing the rough surface, feeling the cold bite of the wood beneath my fingertips. The scars ran deep, like old wounds, each one a reminder of battles fought long ago, memories etched into the tree itself. I pulled my hand away, feeling a strange, almost electric sensation that lingered on my skin, as though the tree itself was alive, pulsing with energy from something unseen. In that instant, a soft sound echoed from somewhere beyond the clearing. It was subtle, almost lost in the silence, but unmistakable. The shuffling of something heavy, moving with the slow, deliberate patience of a predator who knows its territory well. My throat tightened, and I glanced around, scanning the edges of the clearing, but there was nothing, only shadows stretching out like tendrils, closing in from all sides. The noise grew closer, a soft rustling that sent a jolt of fear through me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move, rooted to the spot by a strange, compelling need to understand what had brought me here. My mind raced, imagining every story, every legend I'd ever heard about creatures that roamed these woods, hidden just out of sight. I wondered if this would be my last glimpse of the world as I knew it, swallowed by the shadows of a forest older and more powerful than I could comprehend. And then, as I stood frozen, the rustling stopped. Silence returned, thick and heavy, draping over the clearing like a shroud. But I knew that whatever had been moving was still there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in around me, suffocating and undeniable. I was a trespasser here, caught in the grip of something that held no mercy for the curious or the bold. And as I took a single, cautious step backward, I knew I had only one chance: to leave before whatever watched from the darkness made its presence known. The decision to retreat came as a sudden, instinctual urge, a warning from some ancient part of myself that knew I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to see. I took another slow step backward, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me like an invisible force. The clearing seemed to darken, as though the light itself were retreating, withdrawing into the shadows along with my courage. But just as I prepared to turn and slip back into the depths of the forest, a sound reached me. So soft it might have been imagined, yet piercing in the stillness. It was a whispering, faint and low, a voice that seemed to flow from every direction, curling through the trees and settling around me. It wasn't a voice of words, but a sound that carried meaning, as though the forest itself was speaking, urging me to listen. I stood frozen, listening, each breath shallow as I strained to make sense of the sound. It grew, a low hum that filled the air, a resonance that thrummed through the ground, vibrating up through the soles of my feet. It was familiar and yet foreign, like a language I'd once known and forgotten, something buried in the back of my mind, just out of reach. The sound rose, a cadence that pulsed through the clearing, and with it came an image, unbidden and vivid. Something primal, something ancient. I saw flashes of creatures moving through shadows, their forms indistinct but powerful, shapes that blended with the trees and the darkness. I saw the moon high above, casting its light over the forest, illuminating figures that weren't quite animal, not entirely human, yet bound to the land, a part of it in ways I could never understand. I felt myself swaying, caught in the thrall of the sound, drawn into the images that filled my mind. It was as if the forest were showing me pieces of its own memory, scenes etched into its roots and soil, secrets hidden from the eyes of those who didn't belong. My pulse slowed, the fear ebbing, replaced by a strange calm, a sense of connection that went beyond reason. But just as I began to feel the pull of something deeper, the sound stopped. The silence fell heavy and immediate, snapping me back into myself, breaking the spell that had held me captive. I blinked, disoriented, grounding myself once more in the dark clearing. The shadows seemed thicker now, the trees pressing in closer, and that sense of presence of something watching returned with a vengeance. I turned sharply, feeling the sudden rush of urgency grip me once more. My instincts flared, urging me to leave before the forest changed its mind, before the unknown presence reconsidered its patience with me. I took a step, then another, the chill settling deeper into my bones with each backward glance. Yet even as I tried to make my way out, the feeling of being followed, of eyes in the dark, stayed with me, relentless and inescapable. And then a whisper broke through the silence, so close it felt like it came from just over my shoulder. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end as the sound slithered into my ear. It wasn't a word, not exactly, but a feeling conveyed in sound, an invitation or maybe a warning, something that seeped into my mind and settled deep in my chest. The air around me grew thick, almost suffocating as I strained to listen, my senses heightened. There was movement in the darkness now, the faintest stir of shadows shifting, merging and separating, forming shapes that were almost recognizable. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to align it with the rules of reality. But those rules no longer applied here. I was beyond their reach. The shadow moved closer, slow and deliberate, each step measured, heavy. It was then that I caught a glimpse, just a flash, but enough to see the glint of eyes, larger and closer than before, gleaming with an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. They watched me, unblinking, piercing, the eyes of something that had known the forest for far longer than I had been alive, something that was bound to it in ways I could never be. I took a shaky breath, summoning the last of my courage, and took a step back. But the eyes didn't disappear this time. They held their ground, unwavering, as though they'd decided I had seen enough, that I was no longer free to leave at will. My heart raced, and I glanced around, searching for any hint of a way out, any path that would lead me back to safety. But the shadows moved to close me in, pressing tighter, the clearing shrinking with every heartbeat. The air was charged now, thick with a tension that felt ready to snap. I took another step back, my pulse thrumming in my ears, and for the first time, I felt truly trapped, caught in the gaze of something that would decide whether I was allowed to leave at all. In that moment, I knew one thing with chilling certainty. I was no longer the one in control. The forest, its creatures, its shadows, they were the ones who would decide my fate. And all I could do was wait, held by the force of a presence that was both ancient and alive, watching, waiting as it measured my worth, my intentions, weighing my life against the secrets I had glimpsed. My breath was shallow, almost non-existent, as I stood locked in place, tethered by those eyes. Every instinct screamed to run, to bolt through the dark trees and never look back. But something kept me grounded, a primal understanding that running would trigger a chase, and that it was a chase I wouldn't win. So I stayed, every muscle taut, poised between fear and a strange, aching curiosity. The presence was palpable, pressing against me with a weight that was almost physical. It felt as though the forest itself was breathing, each inhale pulling me deeper into its grip, each exhale a whisper of something ancient and wild. I forced myself to take a slow step back, never breaking eye contact, sensing that whatever held me here was just as aware of my every movement. And then, in the space between heartbeats, the eyes vanished. I blinked, feeling a surge of relief, but the relief was short-lived. The shadows shifted, flowing like liquid between the trees, and in the dim light, I caught glimpses, quick, fleeting images that flickered in the corner of my vision. Something was moving around me, circling with a deliberate, calculated patience, almost as if testing me, waiting to see how I would react. The clearing, once my beacon of safety, now felt exposed, vulnerable. I was an intruder, caught in a place where boundaries were marked by forces beyond my understanding. I took another cautious step back, eyes darting to each shifting shadow, my pulse hammering in my ears as I tried to make sense of the half-seen shapes drifting just out of reach. I felt small, insignificant, a mere trespasser on ground that belonged to something far older, something that thrived in the darkness and the silence. Then a new sound emerged, soft at first but unmistakable. A low, steady growl, guttural and resonant, vibrating through the clearing with a sense of power that was almost tangible. It came from somewhere just beyond my line of sight, hidden within the tangled shadows. The growl was unlike anything I'd heard before, layered and complex, as though it carried a message, a warning, or perhaps a command. My legs trembled as I stood there, every sense heightened, my body on the edge of flight yet frozen in place. The growl echoed, rolling through the trees, each reverberation soaking into the earth beneath my feet. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but the sound held an authority that made it clear I was no longer welcome, that whatever had watched me had decided it was time to act. The shadows shifted again, gathering, thickening at the edge of the clearing. I could feel the intensity of that gaze once more, a cold, assessing presence that seemed to pierce through every layer of me, seeing my thoughts, my fears. I swallowed hard, willing myself to stay calm, my mind racing with possibilities, with the need to understand, to find a way out. Then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the growl ceased. Silence reigned once more, but it was a silence charged with meaning, with a promise of something yet to come. I took a slow step back, unable to shake the feeling that I was being allowed to leave, that the decision to spare me, to let me walk away, had been made for reasons I could never fully comprehend. My foot brushed against something, and I glanced down to see a single, jagged stone half buried in the dirt. It was cold, rough, but as I stared, I felt a strange surge of calm, as if the stone itself had been left there as a reminder, a token of something ancient and watchful. I picked it up, fingers curling around its edges, feeling the connection, the weight of something timeless and wild, a fragment of the forest's own heartbeat. Clutching the stone, I took another step back, then another, my movements slow and deliberate. The shadows seemed to part, allowing me to retreat, each step taking me farther from the clearing and closer to the safety of the trees. But even as I left, the presence lingered, following me in an invisible current, reminding me that I had been marked, remembered by something that lived beyond sight, beyond understanding. The forest seemed to breathe easier as I moved, the air growing lighter, the shadows less oppressive, as though I had been granted passage back to the world I knew. But as I glanced over my shoulder, I knew that I hadn't left unscathed. That clearing, those eyes, the growl that held the weight of ages, I would carry them with me, etched into memory like the scars on the ancient tree. One final glance into the dark revealed nothing but trees, silent and still, as if they'd never seen me, as if the forest had closed itself off from my presence. I took a steadying breath, clinging to the stone in my hand, a reminder of what I'd witnessed, of the line I had crossed and returned from. The quiet settled around me, softer now, less foreboding, yet I could still feel that presence, somewhere distant yet watchful, knowing that I had seen, that I would remember. I turned, facing the path once more, feeling the forest ease its hold, the way out clearer now. But the shadows still whispered, reminding me that the boundary between their world and mine was thin, that I had glimpsed something beyond, something that remained, always waiting, just out of sight. And as I left, I felt its gaze on me, a final reminder that I'd been granted a brief audience with the unknown, an encounter I would never truly leave behind. The path stretched before me, winding through the trees with a familiarity that felt almost comforting. Yet each step I took felt heavier, as though the forest held on to me, reluctant to let me go. I clutched the stone tightly in my hand, feeling its rough surface grounding me, its weight a small reminder of everything that had transpired. Every shadow, every faint sound seemed amplified, pulling me back to the presence I'd just escaped, as though it were woven into the very air around me. The deeper I moved, the more the forest's grip seemed to loosen, the shadows thinning, the path widening as if guiding me back toward safety. I should have felt relieved, yet a strange sadness lingered, a sense of having glimpsed something powerful, something ancient and elusive that was now slipping away. It was as if I'd been allowed a brief peek behind a curtain I wasn't meant to see, and now that vision was fading, slipping back into the depths of the trees. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The silence was profound, as though the forest itself held its breath, but I sensed movement in the periphery, a soft rustling that came and went, barely noticeable yet unmistakable. It was a subtle reminder that my presence here had been noted, marked in some way that felt permanent, an invisible thread connecting me to the shadows I'd left behind. I picked up my pace, my footsteps careful but deliberate, feeling the slight shift in the ground as the path transitioned from soft forest floor to the harder, rockier terrain closer to the forest's edge. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the faintest scent of pine mixed with damp earth, a grounding reminder of the world I was returning to. Yet the whispering shadows clung to me, as though they too were reluctant to release their hold. As I neared the forest's edge, a thought gnawed at me, relentless and unsettling. Had I truly left that presence behind, or had it followed, slipping unseen through the trees, a silent watcher in the veil of shadows? I hesitated, glancing back, half expecting to see those piercing eyes watching from the distance, just out of reach. But there was nothing, only the trees, still and silent, cloaked in the same mystery that had drawn me in. I turned away, determined to leave, yet with each step I felt the weight of something unseen, lingering in the depths of the forest, as though a fragment of it had imprinted on me. The stone in my hand grew colder, its surface rough against my palm, grounding me in a way that felt both comforting and ominous. I realized with a strange clarity that it was more than just a stone. It was a token, a reminder, something that held the energy of the place I'd left behind, as if the forest itself had placed it in my path as a parting gift, or perhaps a mark of recognition. The final steps out of the forest felt surreal, as if I were crossing an invisible boundary between worlds. The air shifted, lighter now, filled with the familiar sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird song. But the forest's hold hadn't fully released me. I could feel it, like a lingering echo, something just beyond reach, watching from the shadows, its gaze following me to the edge and beyond. I finally emerged into the open where the sky stretched vast above, a relief from the suffocating darkness I'd left behind. Yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It stayed, a shadow clinging to my consciousness, a reminder that the boundary between what I understood and what lay hidden was fragile, as thin as the space between one heartbeat and the next. Standing there, I glanced down at the stone, its rough surface cool in my hand, and felt a chill settle over me. The forest might have let me go, but it hadn't truly released me. A part of it lingered, etched into my memory, woven into my very being, a part of something timeless and ancient that would always remain within me. And as I took one last look back at the line of trees, I felt a strange sense of understanding, a quiet acceptance. The forest was a world of its own, filled with secrets and shadows, a place where the ordinary rules didn't apply. It had allowed me to leave, yes, but with the knowledge that I had seen something rare, something that most would never encounter, and that it had seen me in return. The journey back felt surreal, as though I were moving through a dream, each step an echo of those I'd taken within the forest. The weight of the stone in my hand served as a constant reminder, a tether to that other world, one I would carry with me from this moment on. As I made my way home, I knew one thing with quiet certainty: I hadn't left that place behind. It had marked me, as surely as I'd touched the scarred bark of the ancient tree, leaving a trace that would never fully fade. The forest's secrets would remain with me, a silent witness to all I'd seen. And, in some way I couldn't fully understand, a part of me belonged to it now, forever entwined with the shadows and the mysteries I'd glimpsed in its depths. The walk home felt longer, as if the road stretched to accommodate the weight of my thoughts, each step echoing in the quiet dusk that had begun to settle around me. The stone in my hand seemed to grow colder, an anchor grounding me in the waking world, even as my mind lingered back in the forest, replaying the visions, the sounds, the piercing gaze from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that whatever had granted me passage was aware of each step I took, tracking me from afar. As the last slivers of light bled from the sky, I finally reached the edge of town. The comforting glow of streetlights flickered on, casting warm pools of light that felt almost foreign after the dense, consuming darkness of the forest. I welcomed the brightness, the familiarity, yet something in me was unsettled, an awareness that somehow I wasn't quite alone. The world around me felt both too loud and too quiet, as if the ordinary sounds of the town were a mask covering something much older and far more knowing. I paused outside my door, glancing back toward the distant tree line where the forest began, now just a silhouette against the dimming horizon. It looked unassuming, just a line of trees, quiet and still. But I knew better. I could almost feel the presence lurking, the weight of something watching from beyond, as if the forest had extended an invisible thread, connecting me to it even here, on the threshold of my home. Stepping inside, I closed the door firmly behind me, exhaling the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The walls, the familiar smells, the soft glow of my lamp, all of it felt grounding, soothing. I set the stone on a small table near the door, staring at it as if expecting it to move, to offer some sign that it carried more than just the weight of stone. But it lay there still and cold, a simple rock to any passerby. Only I knew what it meant, what it represented, a reminder, a mark. I tried to shake the unease, distracting myself with small routines, forcing normalcy back into my evening. Yet my eyes kept drifting back to the stone, its presence an anchor, pulling my thoughts back to the forest, to the shadowed clearing, to the eyes that had held me captive. Finally, I forced myself to look away, to ignore the pull and go about my evening as if I could leave the memory behind with the closing of a door. As I sat down, the quiet of the house took on a different texture, an awareness woven into the silence. I could almost hear the echo of that low, rumbling growl, feel the weight of the ancient gaze that had followed me. Even here, the air felt charged, as though some unseen presence had followed me home, slipping through the shadows, embedding itself within the quiet. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see a flash of movement, a dark silhouette blending with the night. But there was nothing. Only my reflection, pale and watchful, mirrored in the glass. I turned away, trying to brush off the feeling, yet an instinctual tension lingered, refusing to leave. I knew I'd been granted a rare glimpse into something forbidden, something few others ever experienced. And while I was grateful to have returned, I felt changed, as if a piece of that other world had settled inside me, a quiet voice whispering of places unseen and creatures unknown. Hours passed, yet sleep remained elusive. I lay awake, listening to the gentle creaks and sighs of the house, sounds that had once been familiar, but now seemed filled with an awareness they'd never held before. I thought of the clearing, the twisted branches, the bleached bones scattered like relics on ancient ground. I closed my eyes, but the images stayed vivid, refusing to fade into the recesses of memory. A sudden chill swept through the room, raising goosebumps along my arms. I turned toward the window, feeling an inexplicable urge to look out, to reassure myself that the world beyond was still as it should be. But as I stared into the darkness, I felt a shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible presence that watched from somewhere out of sight, familiar and unsettling. In that moment, I knew the forest hadn't entirely let me go. I was bound to it now, tethered by an invisible thread that stretched from my quiet room back into the depths of those shadowed trees. The stone lay cold on the table, its weight a constant reminder of what I'd seen, of what had seen me in return. I could sense the edge of the unknown brushing against my life, a presence waiting just beyond sight, as if patiently observing, content to remain hidden until it decided otherwise. The forest had followed, its shadows stretching to touch this place, to remind me that the line I'd crossed wasn't easily retraced. I lay still, listening, the silence around me heavy with the knowledge that I would never truly leave that world behind. It had claimed a part of me, and that part would remain, forever entwined with the shadows. The days that followed slipped by in an unsettling blur. The quiet mundanity of life resumed, yet I could feel something had irrevocably changed. The air around me held a weight that hadn't been there before, an awareness that was just shy of tangible. Each morning, I went through my routines, but the memory of the forest clung to me, shadowing my every thought. At times, I caught myself staring out the window, eyes drawn to the distant tree line where it all began, as if expecting something to emerge, watching as I watched. The stone on the table became a fixture, an object I couldn't bring myself to move or discard. I would pass by, feeling its presence like a silent reminder, a link to that other world I had brushed against. Sometimes, as my fingers drifted over its rough surface, I felt a pulse of memory, flashes of the shadowed clearing, the deep growl reverberating through my chest, the eyes that had looked straight through me. The stone seemed to carry a life of its own, holding on to that moment as tightly as I did, as if it too had been marked by something that lay beyond the ordinary. One evening, as dusk crept over the town and the sky turned the color of smoldering embers, I felt a pull stronger than anything I'd experienced since leaving the forest. It was subtle at first, a tug in the back of my mind, growing insistent until it became impossible to ignore. A quiet voice in the depths of my thoughts seemed to whisper, a soft, beckoning sound that I couldn't quite decipher, as though the forest itself were calling me back, reaching out across the distance between us. I found myself slipping on my coat, pulling on my boots without a second thought, as if compelled by something beyond my own will. The walk back to the tree line was a strange one, familiar yet imbued with a new tension. The streets were empty, the shadows of houses stretching long and quiet beneath the setting sun, casting dark shapes that seemed to move, to flicker in the fading light. As I approached the forest, the air grew colder, the trees ahead dark and watchful, silhouetted against the twilight sky. I stopped just before the first line of trees, a chill running down my spine as I stood at the edge, peering into the dense shadows beyond. It felt as if the forest was aware of my presence, waiting to see if I would cross the threshold again, testing the invisible line that had once separated our worlds. Taking a steadying breath, I reached into my pocket and touched the stone, its rough surface grounding me, strengthening me. I took a single step forward, then another, each movement slow and deliberate, as though the forest itself required respect acknowledgement of its dominion. The path wound ahead, familiar yet altered, each tree seeming to lean closer, the shadows stretching, darker and denser than I remembered. As I walked, a rustling sound broke the silence, faint yet unmistakable. My pulse quickened, and I turned, half expecting to see something standing there, waiting, watching. But there was nothing, only the darkening trees and the whisper of wind winding through the branches. Yet the presence was unmistakable, an invisible observer lurking just out of sight, reminding me of the gaze that had followed me all the way home. It was then that I realized the forest had known I would return. It had waited patiently, letting the memory linger and take root, growing into something stronger, something inescapable. I was here not by chance, but by design, as though I were being summoned, invited to step back into the shadowed world that had first marked me. The stone in my hand grew warmer, the roughness pressing into my palm like a heartbeat, steady and strong, linking me to the world beyond my own. I came upon a familiar clearing, and my heart skipped as I noticed the faint, silvery glow filtering through the trees. The ancient tree stood in the center, just as before, its twisted roots like silent guardians protecting the secrets buried in its soil. I moved closer, feeling the ground almost pulse beneath me, as though the earth itself were alive, aware of my presence. I reached out, fingers grazing the bark, feeling its rough texture, the deep scars etched into its surface. A soft rustle came from somewhere behind me, and I froze, heart pounding, the memory of that low, guttural growl echoing in my mind. Slowly I turned, bracing myself, half expecting to see the piercing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. But there was only silence, a deep, profound quiet that felt heavy, intentional, as though the forest itself were waiting for me to understand something, to realize why I'd been drawn back. I took a step forward, feeling the weight of the silence grow thicker, more expectant, and in that stillness I understood. The forest had never truly let me go, nor had it given me a choice. I was bound to it now, part of a world that stretched beyond the visible, a place of shadows and secrets that would forever be just out of reach but never far from my grasp. The silence wrapped around me, dense and unyielding, pressing in from all sides. I felt the weight of the forest settle over my shoulders, a mantle of shadows and secrets that seemed to root me in place. My fingers lingered on the rough bark of the ancient tree, the deep grooves under my touch vibrating faintly, as though the tree itself were breathing, sharing something in hushed whispers that I could almost, but not quite, understand. A sudden shiver traveled up my spine as I sensed movement nearby, small, subtle, a shift in the shadows just beyond the clearing. My heart stilled, my pulse a steady drumbeat against the weight of silence, and I listened, straining to pick up even the faintest sound. But the forest remained quiet, holding its secrets close, as though testing my patience, waiting for me to acknowledge that I was no longer the only one present. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, a soft, rhythmic sound reached me, a distant heartbeat, slow and steady, each thud resonating through the ground beneath my feet. It was faint at first, barely discernible, but it grew stronger, syncing with my own pulse until it was impossible to distinguish between the two. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the trees, merging with the earth, as though the entire forest pulsed with this deep, primal rhythm. The sensation was unnerving yet oddly familiar, like a memory surfacing from the depths of my mind, something I had known instinctively but had forgotten over time. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm take over, feeling my heartbeat fall into sync with it, as though the forest were inviting me to become part of it, to surrender to something greater, something ancient and boundless. As I opened my eyes, a glimmer caught my attention. A faint shimmer within the clearing, low to the ground. I stepped closer, moving carefully, each footfall measured, respectful, as though I were treading sacred ground. The light grew brighter, forming a delicate, shifting shape that hovered just above the earth, its outline indistinct like smoke caught in moonlight. It was mesmerizing, beautiful in a way that defied explanation, an ethereal presence that seemed to breathe with the forest, pulsing in harmony with the heartbeat beneath my feet. I reached out, fingers grazing the edges of the light, and a warmth spread through me, soothing yet powerful, filling me with a sense of belonging that I couldn't explain. In that moment, the forest felt alive in a way I had never perceived before. its presence not just surrounding me, but moving through me, as though I were part of its vast, intricate web. But just as I was beginning to lose myself in the sensation, a sharp crack broke the silence, a branch snapping underfoot somewhere to my left. I turned quickly, my senses alert, the warmth replaced by a spike of adrenaline. The shadows thickened, darkening along the edges of the clearing, and that faint glow began to flicker, wavering as though threatened by an unseen force. I held my breath, scanning the darkness, feeling the forest shift from welcoming to watchful, as though it too sensed the change. The shadows seemed to deepen, pooling around the trees, merging into a shape that was all too familiar, a tall, hulking figure, just barely visible against the dim light. It didn't move, didn't come closer, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me, powerful and deliberate, watching, assessing. This time, I didn't freeze. Instead, I took a steadying breath, feeling the heartbeat of the forest beneath me, anchoring me. I knew now that I was part of this place, connected to it in a way that transcended fear, and that knowledge gave me strength. I held my ground, meeting the figure's gaze, feeling a strange calm settle over me as I stood there, face to face with the presence that had haunted my every step since that first night. A low rumble echoed through the clearing, a sound layered with something I couldn't quite decipher, curiosity perhaps, or recognition. It was less a threat and more a statement, an acknowledgement of my presence, a wordless acceptance that felt ancient, as if I were being welcomed into something much larger than myself. Slowly, the figure began to fade, merging back into the shadows as if dissolving into the very fabric of the forest. The glow at the center of the clearing pulsed one last time before dimming, leaving only a faint impression on the earth, like a memory written in starlight. The heartbeat beneath my feet softened, fading into the quiet, until only my own pulse remained, steady and strong. As the forest settled around me, the silence returned, but it was no longer the oppressive stillness of before. It was calm, peaceful, a gentle reminder that I was now part of this place, bound to it in a way that couldn't be undone. I took a final, lingering look at the clearing, feeling a strange mixture of awe and gratitude before turning to leave, my steps echoing softly in the darkness. The forest let me go this time, parting around me like a veil, yet I could feel its gaze following, a quiet promise in the shadows that I would never truly leave. I was part of it now, as much a part of its mystery as the ancient trees and the shifting shadows. And as I stepped back onto the path that would lead me home, I knew that this connection would linger, forever woven into the fabric of my life, a heartbeat that would echo in my memory, long after I left the forest behind. The walk back felt surreal, as if I were drifting between worlds, each step lighter than the last. The forest's presence trailed behind me, no longer a looming weight, but a gentle reminder, like the feeling of a steady hand resting on my shoulder. The night air was crisp, sharp in my lungs, and as I neared the edge of the tree line, I felt an inexplicable longing, a quiet ache that settled somewhere deep inside, a yearning for something I was only beginning to understand. When I stepped out of the forest, the open sky stretched above me, vast and clear, stars scattered like sparks against the dark. The cool light of the moon bathed the landscape, and I paused, glancing back at the trees that stood silent and watchful, silhouetted against the night. It was strange. They seemed smaller now, less intimidating, as though their shadows had softened, no longer barriers, but guardians, standing at the threshold of a place that welcomed me as one of its own. A part of me felt reluctant to leave, as though walking away would sever the connection I had so tenuously formed. I let my fingers drift to the stone in my pocket, its weight grounding me, a physical reminder of the forest's touch. Holding it seemed to reaffirm my bond with the shadows I had left behind, reassuring me that no matter how far I walked, I would carry a part of the forest within me, its secrets etched into my memory. The journey home was quiet, the town dark and still, save for a few distant lights blinking from windows as people settled into their nightly routines, oblivious to the world that pulsed just beyond the edge of the woods. I could feel the weight of their ordinary lives brushing against me, a stark contrast to the intangible mystery that clung to my skin. It felt almost like stepping back into a life that was no longer entirely mine, a space where I had to balance two worlds, neither one complete without the other. When I reached my door, I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder once more, feeling the faint pull of the forest in the distance. I could almost hear the rustle of leaves, the low hum that had pulsed through the clearing, a steady heartbeat whispering just beyond reach. The thought of returning filled me with a sense of inevitability, as though the forest had claimed me as much as I had sought it, the pull woven into my bones, its rhythms aligning with my own. Inside, the house felt warmer, smaller than before, its walls close and comforting yet somehow foreign, like a place I had known in a distant life. I set the stone on the windowsill, letting it catch the moonlight that poured through the glass, casting a soft, silvery glow across its rough surface. In the quiet, I could almost imagine it pulsing, a faint rhythm that mirrored the forest's own, a gentle reminder of the presence that had watched, that had acknowledged me, even if only for a moment. As I settled in for the night, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind caught between reality and memory, replaying every detail of the encounter. I thought of the low growl, the shadows shifting just out of sight, the way the trees had closed in around me like a protective cocoon, drawing me into a place where time felt suspended. I remembered the way the forest had breathed, had come alive with a hum that reverberated through my core, making me feel like part of something far larger, far more ancient than myself. Hours passed in quiet contemplation, the house steeped in silence as I lay in the dark, letting the memories settle, their edges softened by the passage of time. The faint glow of dawn began to seep through the window, and I closed my eyes, finally feeling the pull of sleep. Yet even as I drifted off, I could feel the forest in my thoughts, a quiet presence lingering at the edge of my consciousness, like a door that had been left ajar, inviting me to return whenever I was ready. And in that space between waking and sleep, I felt a strange sense of peace, a certainty that I was connected to something timeless, something that transcended the boundaries of ordinary life. The forest's heartbeat resonated within me, a silent promise that I would always be welcome in its depths, that the bond I had formed would remain unbroken, whether I returned in body or only in spirit. As sleep finally claimed me, the last thing I saw in my mind's eye was the shadowed clearing, the ancient tree standing at its center, waiting, patient and eternal, a silent guardian of secrets that would forever remain part of my own. And as I slipped into dreams, I knew the forest would be there, just beyond the edge of sleep, its whispers trailing into the quiet, reminding me that I was never truly alone. Sleep enveloped me in a gentle haze, the kind that blurs the edges of consciousness, leaving me drifting between reality and memory. In my dreams, the forest came alive, its shadows moving with intent, forming shapes that shifted and blended into one another. The clearing appeared before me, the ancient tree towering in the center, its branches stretching like silent arms, beckoning. Everything was sharp, vivid, the scent of damp earth, the cool weight of the stones still in my palm, the heartbeat of the forest resonating in time with my own. In the dream, I walked toward the tree, each step feeling purposeful, as if drawn by a path that had always been there, waiting for me to recognize it. The air was thick with a familiar tension, a hushed reverence that filled me with both fear and awe. As I reached the tree, I saw markings carved deep into its bark, symbols I couldn't read but somehow understood, a language as old as the forest itself, etched by hands that might not have been human. I touched the scars on the tree, feeling the history woven into them, stories that spanned ages, told and retold through every groove, every line. My hand tingled against the bark, a warmth spreading from my palm up my arm as though the tree was transferring something into me, a fragment of its memory, a whisper of its wisdom. The pulse of the forest's heartbeat grew louder, vibrating through the air, filling my senses until I was wrapped in its rhythm, held by something older and stronger than anything I had ever known. And then, the shadows around the clearing shifted, forming a shape, a familiar figure, tall and watchful, emerging from the darkness with a silent grace. It was the same presence I had felt before, the one that had watched me from the shadows, that had trailed me through the trees. But this time, it did not linger at the edge of sight. It moved forward, its form clearer now, standing before me with an otherworldly stillness. Its eyes met mine, deep and dark, filled with an intelligence that seemed to see beyond sight, as if reading the very fabric of who I was. We stood in silence, two beings connected by a shared understanding that words could never capture. I felt no fear, only a profound sense of reverence, a recognition that I was in the presence of something bound to the forest, something as much a part of it as the trees and shadows, a guardian or a guide perhaps, or something older still, a spirit woven into the very essence of the land. Slowly, it raised a hand, or perhaps a paw, its form flickering between human and beast as if it straddled both worlds. It touched the bark beside my own hand, resting its fingers, its claws on the ancient tree. The forest pulsed in response, a deep vibration that surged through both of us, connecting us in that moment, bridging the space between human and shadow, between the ordinary and the sacred. I felt my heartbeat sync with the pulse, a timeless rhythm that bound me to this place, to this creature, to the unseen world that pulsed beneath the surface of my own. And then, just as suddenly, the vision began to fade, dissolving into the familiar darkness of sleep. The presence lingered, though, a faint outline in my mind, like the final notes of a melody that would never fully leave me. The shadows melted away, replaced by the soft gray of early morning filtering through my window. When I awoke, the room was quiet, bathed in the gentle light of dawn. I felt different, as though a part of me had been left in the forest, tethered to the shadows and trees, to the eyes that had watched, the whispers that had called me back. The stone lay on the windowsill, still and silent, yet I sensed it held a power, a memory of that night, a token that kept the connection alive, reminding me that the boundary between our worlds was thinner than it seemed. As I rose, the weight of the experience settled into me, not a burden, but a quiet certainty that I was no longer just an observer of the forest. I was part of it. The shadows would always remember, just as I would, bound to the heartbeat that pulsed in the darkness, a shared rhythm that stretched across dreams and waking life. I stood by the window, staring toward the tree line in the distance, feeling that familiar pull, knowing that the forest would always be there, waiting, watching, a quiet presence just beyond sight. And as I watched the dawn break over the trees, I felt a sense of peace, a knowing that some journeys never truly end, that some connections defy explanation, bridging worlds we can only begin to understand. The forest had left its mark on me, as surely as I had touched the scarred bark of the ancient tree. I knew that one day I would return.